Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Compliance Guy. My name is Sean Weiss, and as always, I want to say thank you for taking time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to tune in and listen to what it is that I and my special guests, as is the case today, what we're actually talking about. And I think today our topic is one that gets airtime, but I don't think it gets the type of interaction that we're going to have on this podcast today. Um, Obviously, we want to stay away from issues that are highly politicized. We want to stay away from issues that are utilized or weaponized in the media for whatever reason they are. But we want to have an open, honest conversation about the clinical impact as well as the investigations that take place um, dealing with the opioid crisis in America. And for me, this is obviously a topic that I believe is far from over. And in fact, I would honestly venture to say it is worse now than when folks said we were at our worst dating back into 2017 or 2018. The fact of the matter is simple. In 2019, it was estimated that nearly 50,000 Americans died from opioid involved overdoses. Prescription pain relievers are as problematic. Folks, they are. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Prescription pain relievers are as problematic as illegal drugs on the streets, such as heroin and fentanyl. But unfortunately, we're not talking as much about the prescription crisis because Big Pharma continues to pull the strings of Congress. Remember in the late 90s when Big Pharma companies reassured the American public and the medical community that patients could and would never become addicted to prescription opioid pain relievers. And as a result, providers began to obviously increase the volume of their prescriptions for these drugs. Now, look, there is no dispute that this led to widespread misuse of these pain relievers, and to honestly make matters worse, drug diversion became a huge issue. Again, these prescriptions are highly addictive. In 2017, approximately 47,000 Americans fell victim to these prescriptions, as well as illicit street drugs like heroin and fentanyl, as I said prior. But here's the more disturbing statistic. More than 1.7 million Americans suffered from substance use disorders related to prescription opioid pain relievers, and compared with an approximated, you ready for this? 650,000 suffering from heroin use disorders. It it it's just unbelievable. But anyways, let me get off of my soapbox here and let me introduce my two very special guests who I'm really excited to have these gentlemen on the show because they are consummate professionals. They have both become very good friends to me and to the show. And I want to make sure that I give them the proper platform for us to be able to talk about this stuff. And I know all of you, as my listeners, those of you that are viewing us on the video portion of this on LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube, um, I think you're going to really appreciate these two gentlemen and the backgrounds that they both bring to the table. My first guest that I'll introduce is Matt Lawhon. Matt has been a guest on the show previously, and if you tune in to Coffee, Compliance, and Chuckleheads, Matt has been on our show there as well. And for over a decade, Matt investigated healthcare fraud and abuse. First, as a senior investigator for the Medicare Benefits Integrity Contractor in Texas, which is now referred to as a Unified Program Integrity Contractor, or a UPIC. And then as a criminal investigator for the Texas Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, better known as MFUCU. Matt has investigated hundreds of fraud and abuse cases, both at the state and federal level. He also frequently assisted in the development of cases by the Medicare Fraud Strike Force, and his success in these investigations resulted in recognition by both Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General and the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Again, Matt is an accomplished healthcare investigator. Matt's developed distinct insights into techniques utilized by agencies that have regulatory or investigative authority over healthcare providers, such as the ZPIC, which is now the UPICs, the RACs, the MACs, the Office of Inspector General, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the MFUCU, the single state agencies, and state medical boards. Again, Matt has a incredible in-depth knowledge of the major health laws governing healthcare delivery practices, including the Anti-Kickback, Stark, and False Claims Act, in addition to the Sunshine Act. And as an attorney, he has used his valuable knowledge to counsel pharmacies, laboratories, chiropractors, physician groups, home health agencies, and other healthcare providers. And again, one of the things I always like to point out is that prior to Matt becoming an attorney, he was a distinguished police officer with the Dallas Police Department. And obviously, I want to say thank you to Matt for his service. And that leads me to my other special guest. And this is a guest that I've had an opportunity to appear on Monday Monitor with. We've had a lot of dialogue on LinkedIn and through other channels. And he's a really great guy. Dr. Ronald Hirsch, MD, FACP, CHCQM, CHRI. He's got all kinds of credentials. Really neat and interesting gentleman. Dr. Hirsch is the Vice President of Physician Advisory Solutions at R1 RCM. And he's a leader in healthcare quality management with particular focus on inpatient and outpatient care and centers for Medicare and Medicaid services regulations. I see a ton of his posts talking about the OPPS, the Medicare physician fee schedule. He talks about really niche aspects of healthcare. He always has tremendous insights, and he's definitely not afraid to throw it out there and give his opinion, which I appreciate. Dr. Hirsch is board certified by the American Board of Quality Assurance and Utilization Review Physicians with Physician Advisor Subspecialty Designation. He's a member of the advisory boards of the American College of Physician Advisors and the National Association of Healthcare Revenue Integrity. He is a fellow of the American College of Physicians and the American Board of Quality Assurance and Utilization Physician Reviews. He is a co-author of the Hospital Guide to Contemporary Utilization Review, which is published by HC Pro. He is an editorial board member of RACmonitor.com with a weekly segment on Monday Monitor. I believe it's called Monday Rounds with Dr. Hirsch, if my memory serves correctly, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. And he's a course director for Athena Forum, internal medicine residency at Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Los Angeles, California, board certified in internal medicine. Man, I could go on and on and on, but we have a show to do. So, gents, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for being here with me today. As I said at the beginning of the show, this is a topic that gets airtime, but maybe not in a way that I think we're going to discuss it today, and certainly without all of the partisan politics playing out in Congress and in the media. So, again, welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Hirsch and Matt Lawhon.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's always good to get to chat with you. And I'm looking forward to Dr. Hirsch's perspective on everything.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I'll tell you, I don't know about Matt, but the one thing I really hate about these things is listening to my introduction. I'd rather often that people just say, he's a doctor, let's talk to him. But
I'm with you, Doc. I feel like Sean's introduction of me could have been, he was a pretty decent investigator, and now he's a mediocre attorney, and we'll just leave it at that.
But if I say that, people aren't going to want to tune in because they're going to be like, well, I could listen to Joe Schmo anywhere. I want to hear the best, and that's why I'm asking the best to be on the show. But to your point, I could redo the intro if you'd like. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Lawhon, sort of a good investigator and sort of a good attorney, and Dr. Ronald Hirsch, a doctor. All right, guys.
All right, now we're ready to roll now.
We're ready to roll. Welcome to the show. Thank you again for being here. It's really a privilege to be able to spend time with you guys, and thank you for your friendship. Dr. Hirsch, I want to first turn to you. You wrote an article about 5 years ago on Kevin MD, titled "The Opioid Epidemic. It's time to place blame where it belongs." And for all of our listeners, I will make sure that I post a link to the article. I've read it. I actually read it a couple of times. I thought it was a very well put article. I think it um, calls out who needs to be called out. I think it places blame where it needs to be placed. But I'm guessing it didn't make you a lot of friends in some respects when you were calling out certain folks. But before we get into that, let's talk about the substance of that article, and if you could, for our viewers, kind of give everybody a background.
Sure. But let me start just from the legal side of things to say that I'm speaking to the audience really as a physician, not as a representative of R1. I'm going to be talking about my 21 years as a primary care physician and as a physician advisor at a community hospital in the Chicago area. So my opinions don't represent those of my employers at all. So the reason I wrote this article back in 2016 was it was kind of in the midst of the epidemic and trying to figure out what we're going to do with all these people who are abusing opioids. And there's a lot of blame put on physicians for overprescribing. And having worked in a hospital, in an office, seen patients in emergency departments, I realized, most of us physicians were really kind of innocent bystanders in this pandemic, in this epidemic. Then we were faced with this brand new drug that was being told to us and was FDA approved as being less addictive. Right. We were also faced by pressures from all kinds of organizations to make sure that our patients had satisfaction, that they were satisfied with the services that they were being provided. And pain is ubiquitous. Everybody has some degree of pain. And there became this idea that the goal should be everybody should have a pain-free life, and that pain can be conquered. Every kind of pain can be brought down to zero. So it just created this perfect storm that resulted in thousands of people receiving opioids for benign reasons. And just due to the nature of opioids, a certain percentage of those people are going to develop tolerance, physiologic dependence, and then potentially addiction. And, as a physician, I wanted to get some of the pressure off of us and realize that all these other forces were doing it. So I wrote this article.
Yeah, and I think there were a lot of things in that article that obviously stood out to me, and I'd like to talk about some of those, right? As long as you're okay with that. But one of the first ones that I had brought up to you, obviously prior to the start of the show, is talking about the lack of increased efficacy. Talk a little bit about that, if you would, please.
Well, I think opioids do work great for pain. There's no question about it. But if they didn't have any side effects or any addiction or tolerance, we could use them great. I mean, you don't develop an addiction to penicillin or to any antibiotics, but opioids, they do that. So, do they work better than other drugs? Well, if you actually look at some of the studies, a person with kidney stones, which they say for men is the worst pain you can have, the efficacy of anti-inflammatories is really equal to that of opioids in reducing pain.
I'm not joking. You literally read my mind as you were starting to talk about that, because I had a kidney stone, and my wife, she's like, until you've gone through child labor and birth, you don't understand. And I'm like, you're right, I don't. But I had a kidney stone, and it was horrible. They gave me fentanyl. They gave me, back then, they were still using not Dilaudid, Demerol.
Sure.
Didn't touch the pain. They gave me Toradol, and it completely wiped out the pain prior to them having to go in and do the procedure to get the stone. But it's amazing to me that there are non-narcotics that are as effective, if not more effective, in treating a breakthrough pain, or minimizing the amount of pain that somebody's in. So that's something that I think a lot of people, there may be some awareness of that, but maybe not as much as there should be, because for so long, you go to your doctor and you say, I got a crick in my neck, or I got a pain in my low back, or my knee is hurting. And prior to the crackdown on this stuff, there would be a script written for a hydrocodone or an oxycodone or something like that. I mean, is that a fair statement to make?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we want our patients to get relief of pain. Have to remember that pain medications don't treat the cause of the pain. They just make you could say not care about it. What you need to do is fix what's causing the pain. I've got a sword stabbed through my chest and it hurts like heck. I don't necessarily want the pain cured. I want the sword to get out so I don't die from it.
That's right.
So we got to also, remember that.
Yeah.
And that was part of that patient satisfaction push, is we started surveying patients in the hospital. Are you satisfied with the care? And doctors realized that when patients came in with pain, if we didn't address, the pain rather than the cause of the pain, they were going to give us bad scores. Bad scores lead to some administrators saying, hey, you're not performing well, give more pain medications. And there goes the vicious circle.
Yeah, and you were really headed in a direction that because you had previously mentioned about the patient satisfactions, and I was a former hospital administrator years and years ago, and obviously satisfaction surveys are always one of the top hit list items that administrators are looking at. How do we improve on our food? How do we improve on the quality of the beds? How do we improve on the quality of the cleanliness, our nursing staff, engagement of the physicians, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a huge, huge issue. And in your article, you brought up Press Ganey, and you also brought up the UC Davis study, which is out of Sacramento, UC Davis, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the Press Ganey issue, and then talk a little bit about the UC Davis study?
So Press Ganey is a company. It's a commercial company that sells surveys to hospitals. I don't know whether they're officially certified by CMS or if it's just one of the companies that can be used, but it's the most common patient satisfaction survey. And patients who get discharged from the hospital, either from the ED or the hospital, as a patient, will get the survey, fill it in, send it back. It gets attributed to a physician, or a unit, and those scores get reported publicly. It affects star ratings that go up on billboards, health grade scores, et cetera. So it's a big deal. Now, the UC Davis study, actually, they tried to correlate patient satisfaction with patient outcomes. And what they found in their study is that patients who were highly satisfied used more services, right, cost more, and had poorer outcomes. Because if you think about it, what was happening is that physicians were kind of feeling pressure to do things for patients to satisfy them, but maybe it not be the best thing for them. Right? The patient who came in, you come in after a football game with a sore knee, and your friend had an MRI, and you ask for an MRI, and the doctor says, you don't need an MRI. You've now resulted in an unsatisfied patient. But if that MRI gets done, because we want to satisfy you, and it shows an incidental finding, and you go off to surgery, the surgery doesn't go well, now we've created this whole cascade of problems, all caused by trying to satisfy you by ordering a test that wasn't necessarily needed.
That's a great point. One of the most interesting cases that I ever argued in front of an administrative law judge for the Office of Medicare Hearing and Appeals for Medicare. The argument that I made was tied to the days when the office visits were still based on the bean counting, if you will, right, for the medical decision making, and everybody took into account prescription drug management. And my doctor that I was representing happened to believe that, I'm not just going to write a script. For me, I went to school to learn how to deploy my clinical judgment. I learned how to evaluate an individual based on these factors. And for me to simply write a script, I'm doing a disservice. I'm doing an injustice to the patient in many cases. And my argument to the judge when, the argument was, why should it be a level 4 versus a level 3? My argument to the judge was, Your Honor, the hardest decision that a medical professional will ever make is not writing a script. It is harder for somebody to say, no, I'm not writing a prescription for something than it is for them to just say, that's an expectation. Let me just go ahead and write that script for them. I mean, you're a physician. You've been a physician, I think you said, for more than 20 years. How hard of a decision was it for you to not write a script for a patient?
It's tough. I mean, nothing treats a viral infection better than a Z-Pak. That's a joke amongst physicians because patients always want their Z-Pak, and we know with viral infections, it's going to get better in 3 days with it or 72 hours without it.
Yeah. Have you ever read the back of a Z-Pak package? And I mean, it literally can treat, I think, 80 something different afflictions or problems. It's quite concerning how frequently Z-Paks are prescribed.
Right. It is tough. But again, the prescription takes 30 seconds. To not prescribe it takes 5 minutes of explanation. And for some physicians, when you have 10 patients in your waiting room and you're trying to get through and there's not enough doctors anyways, it's the short way to do it. I think pain medication, again, prescribing is, Matt has probably seen in his career, someone comes in with pain, I'm going to believe them and I'm going to prescribe a pain medication. Word gets out on the street that, hey, Dr. Hirsch gives out pain prescriptions. It creates a kind of a built-in audience for that doctor, patient pool. And suddenly lots of people are coming in with pain. Yeah. Now my data looks funny. Now I'm showing up on somebody's report. Yeah. Pharmacists now know that, we better watch this guy. He seems to be ordering a lot of OxyContin. What's going on there?
Yeah. And, and Matt, I'm going to get to you here in just a second, but, Doc, part of this whole evolution to getting you onto the podcast came from a blog post that I put out on LinkedIn about the opioid toolkits. And I know, Matt, you had some thoughts on that as well. And, I've had 2 doctors in the last 6 months. One of them kicked out of Walmart with no appeals process. And Walmart's an interesting situation. We could talk about that later if there's time. And the other one, which I think they handled it really well, was CVS and Walgreens. They reached out, they sent a letter and said, we have some concerns about your prescribing habits. And we would like to have a conversation with you to understand better why your numbers look different than your peers of your same taxonomy in your same GeoZip. And we got onto the calls with CVS, and this was a pain management doctor here in Georgia. We got onto the calls with CVS, with Walgreens. He explained his process. He talked about all of the aspects of urine drug tox screenings, etc. And, they were satisfied. We got a letter within 72 hours saying, thank you for your time. We appreciate your cooperation. We're in complete understanding with what it is that you're doing for your patient. And this is a good doctor. This is not a pill mill doctor. This is somebody who discharges patients regularly when he finds out that they're getting Xanax from another doctor, or they're, diverging some of their medication to a family member or to a buddy or something like that. But Matt, one of the things that came out in Dr. Hirsch's KevinMD.com article that I read had to do, and I'm calling it the fraud perpetrated against doctors in the American public when Big Pharma said opioids were not addictive. You've had lots of investigations over your career,
right?
But you had one specific investigation that wound up before the medical board in Texas. And before you talk about that, I want to make certain that everybody understands that these are allegations. This never was sought as a criminal matter against the provider. So what you're about to hear from Matt are what led to the need for an investigation, what techniques were utilized during the investigation, and then sort of how this thing wound up where it was at. And then Dr. Hirsch, I definitely want to get your opinions on this particular provider. So Matt, go ahead. Let me turn it over to you.
Yeah. So, this case was a case that started back in, I'm trying to think, it might have been late 2010. Like you said, it was addressed by the medical board. It was turned down for prosecution. So everything that we're talking about, like you pointed out, is truly, it's an allegation. Now there were settlements done by the medical board with the physician, and there is public record relating to his conduct, but because it didn't go anywhere criminally, I won't get into the specific city he was at or his name. I don't want to put anybody out there like that when we're dealing with simple allegations. But to your original question, so the case came out about 2010, late 2010. It was something that I discovered proactively. When I was an investigator, I tried to be very proactive in my approach to identifying cases. And what I did, I had access to data. I could run reports myself. And so at the time, the opioid crisis wasn't necessarily a crisis yet. There was rumblings and grumblings about more and more people becoming addicted to opioids, that patients were abusing them, things to that nature. And so what I did was simply run a report for certain drugs and look to see who was kind of a high prescriber for these particular drugs. I think at the time, the combination that was most prevalent was hydrocodone or OxyContin, right? A muscle relaxer, quercepratal, and a benzodiazepine, usually Xanax, right? And so I looked at those three drugs, and what I was discovering was this particular physician who was not in a large town, a large city, or large metropolitan area, was in the top 10 prescribers in the state, and he was matching some hospital systems for the amount of drugs that he was prescribing. So from there, I wanted to see, okay, what does his medical license look like? And so, a lot of the states, Texas being one of them, has all their disciplinary actions taken against physicians as a public record. So when I looked at his medical license, I discovered that the medical board had taken action against him for his prescriptive practice. He was negligent, not negligent in the legal sense of the word, but they were holding him accountable for not kind of implementing any protections of patient abuse of the drugs. So I said, okay, so I have a physician that's a high prescriber of these very addictive, dangerous combinations of drugs. He's been disciplined for them before. And then when I look at his billings through the Medicaid program or to the Medicaid program, he was at the time that I looked, he was probably in the millions of dollars as far as getting payments from Medicaid. And that's just on Medicaid, realizing that Medicaid's a payer of last resort, that, a lot of people underestimate the amount of dual eligible beneficiaries. So a patient that's covered under Medicare and Medicaid. And when that's the case, Medicaid pays the 20% where Medicare pays the 80%. And so what I had was just through Medicaid, a physician that is prescribing a lot of addictive substances or narcotics, been in trouble, and he's being paid a lot under this one program. When I took a little bit deeper of a dive, I started to notice that he was mainly performing facet joint injections and transforaminal injections. And that was kind of the basis of my opening the case. I reached out to HHS OIG, and the agent that I had a good relationship with over there looked through their system, discovered that OIG Office of Audit had looked at him and identified this particular provider as kind of an outlier when it came to these services. And so based on that kind of initial information, we started to open up a case and start working to see where we could go with it.
And if I could pause you just for a
Yeah,
second.
you bet.
So I know that I have physicians that watch this program or listen to the podcast, and I want to make certain that they understand how critical it is that their documentation is dotting every I, crossing every T, especially when we're talking
Right.
about pain medication. Okay, we're talking about drug therapies for these patients, and I know Dr. Hirsch, you could talk for hours about this, but beyond that, the most important thing that a practice can do is to have policies and procedures in place that specifically spell out how the drugs are going to be distributed, who's eligible, the frequency for drug screening. I mean, you have got to have a comprehensive compliance program. And I'm not just talking about your OIG corporate compliance program. I'm talking about very specific policies and procedures. I want to give our folks just a few of the issues that you as the investigator identified, okay? The respondent's conduct, as described below, placed these patients at risk of harm from developing addictions to the prescribed controlled medications. Now, if I'm not mistaken, some of these patients actually died.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was one of the things that we were looking at. And I think, this part of the investigation somewhat dovetails nicely into Dr. Hirsch's earlier discussion about treating the actual pain. One of the things that this physician was doing, he would perform these injections allegedly under fluoroscopic guidance. And what would happen is they would have injection days, and the nurses for the clinic would gather up the corticosteroid, dump it into a bowl, dump saline into that bowl, mix it up, and then that's what they would draw all the syringes from. And they would have about 1,000 syringes for injection day. And then what he would do is, it wasn't fluoroscopic guidance because he wasn't using the fluoroscope as a live X-ray tool. What he was doing is have the patient lay down, take a snapshot of the patient's spine. So if anybody, opinion, right? If anybody asked, they would say, yeah, they use the fluoroscope. And then he would just stick them with the needle like 6 times, right? His documentation will reflect that he utilized a certain amount, I think it was 1 cc of corticosteroid in each shot. What our investigation revealed was he did not have purchased enough of the steroid in order to satisfy all those claims that he billed. So going back to Dr. Hirsch's point, he wasn't really doing a good job of treating the sword that's in the chest, right? And so these patients would still have pain, and he would prescribe them the combination of drugs. Now, he prescribed a bunch of different ones, with the main ones being like hydrocodone, Soma, and Xanax. And then, what would happen is, like you pointed out, yeah, some of these patients died. And when I was able to research further and get a hold of the autopsies, we were finding that the cause of death for a lot of these people were mixed drug intoxication, and the drugs that he had prescribed were the ones that were at lethal levels, right? And I based that off of the interviews that I did with, I think I did 8 or 9 interviews of various pathologists in the Metroplex that had performed autopsies on his patients. So.
Yeah, and Dr. Hirsch, I know you looked this over as well, and there were some things that definitely stood out to you. And I guess a fraudster is always going to be a fraudster, and no matter what you say to them, they're just not going to change. They're in it for the money. But talk about some of the things as a board certified physician, a physician with strong ethics. Some of the things that stood out to you.
So what amazed me was reading through that was that one patient I think received a 300 and something spinal injections, right? I mean, that, they should be given once every 3 or 6 months, one injection. So if you think about the timeline, it just doesn't make sense, right? Again, don't know anything about the case, just surmising that what this doctor did is said, if you want to come in and get your refills, you have to agree to be subjected to an injection so that he could bill for a procedure. One of the problems in medicine, I'm sure you've all heard, is that medicine, it pays well if you do things, but doesn't pay well if you don't, right? A physician, an internist who's prescribing blood pressure medicine doesn't make as much as an orthopedist fixing joints. So that doctor knows just seeing the patient for pain, there's much less reimbursement than if they actually do a procedure. And obviously adding fluoroscopy is another billable code, et cetera. So he was using that as a coercive way to get, for patients to be able to get their prescriptions refilled. Now, how many of these patients truly had pain, or how many of them had an opioid use disorder, and this was less expensive to get your opioids from a doctor than from on the street? That's a very difficult balance that we're facing a lot. The patient coming into my office, did they really have pain, or did they have an opioid disorder? I can tell you, it's very public. Stephen King, the author, was in a terrible car accident. He was placed on OxyContin. He developed an addiction, and he's written and talked about how when he finally got off of the opioids, he realized that all that time he thought he had pain, he actually didn't. It was the opioids, as he said, creating the pain so that you would go and get more opioids to meet that need.
So it's like an illusion almost.
Yeah. But it's very hard to tell who's having an illusion and who's not.
Well,
and I think, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was going to say, and to kind of address that thought, Doc, one of the techniques that we utilized in the development of this case was we did some cross-claims analysis. What we did was we took his patient universe and we started looking at specific, it's ICD-10 codes now, it used to be ICD-9 codes, right? And we started looking at opioid dependence, overdoses, all these diagnosis codes that would indicate some sort of adverse reaction to the medication, and identify the providers that were treating his patients for these services. What that allowed us to do was it allowed us to kind of target specific patients, maybe for interviews, but certainly at the time when we conducted a search warrant, we were going to hone in on those particular patient files. And in reviewing those patient files, a number of them would have documentation in there that indicated some other physician had treated the patient for overdose, or this patient had just come out of rehab for drug addiction, or the patient's families were calling the physician to let them know, hey, this patient is abusing the drugs. Not only are they abusing them, but they're also taking them with alcohol. And, it was amazing to me to the number of patients where there these serious red flags to indicate either patient abuse of the medication or diversion of the medication. And so, it kind of helped us in developing and crafting the narrative of what we're moving forward with.
Yeah, this provider for this investigation, there were 7 patients that were involved. To me, I'm scratching my head on how criminal charges were not brought against this provider. I just don't understand. But to Dr. Hirsch's point, patient 1 received 390 spine injections. 390 spine injections. And we're talking over the course of what, a year and a half? And beyond that, the patient was abusing alcohol while utilizing these medications and was experiencing severe side effects. And the patient was seen in the emergency room, and the patient ultimately expired a year and 4 months after he began treatment with this physician. And it clearly indicated in the allegations, and again, these were the allegations, that the respondent added, increased, decreased, and changed the patient's medications without clinical indication for any of these changes. They did not perform urine drug screens or any actions that would confirm the patient's compliance with the opioid therapy. I mean, I know there's a big to do, and Doc, I think you were blogging about this, or you talked about it on Monday Monitor. The government's going after practices for the excessive amount of urine drug tox screenings that are being performed. That just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah. It's really complicated. First, I have to tell you, we got to be careful, Sean. If Matt's going to start talking about ICD 9 or 10 codes, we're going to have to get Sanal Patel on. So warn him he can't do that.
There is the shout out to Sanal. Sanal, you are just a wonderful person, and you definitely deserve all the shout outs that you get.
I'm connected with her on LinkedIn. She's commented and liked some of my posts. I've done the same for her. I haven't had the pleasure of speaking with her in person. So, if this is the impetus in getting us all together, so be it. I'll fall on that sword, right?
I was fortunate enough to have Sanal come on my program, and she was just such a breath of fresh air. Doc, I want to go back to you for a moment. Go ahead. You were going to say something, please.
I think, this case is really the outlier, but let me tell you in my practice, right,
please,
some of the things that I encountered. So I had lots of patients, who had legitimate pain and got treated and did well. I had one patient, she was, I think, 35 years old, married, good job, 2 kids, who had this hereditary muscle disorder. And she had been started on pain medications a long time ago, and she was taking it and moved to our city, and I took over her care, got records, everything was confirmed. The state came out with the prescription drug monitoring database where we could look up patients, right? And so I could, for those that don't know, you could put in a patient's information, and it'll show you all of the controlled substances that they had been prescribed in the state. Right. Now, this was the last person in the world that I would think that I would need to look up, but I looked her up, and sure enough, she was seeing another primary care physician in another town getting prescriptions on a regular basis. And I asked her about it, and she said, yeah, I've been doing that. But I promise you, I've been taking the pills you've been prescribing, and I'm just selling the ones that other doctor prescribes for me. I said, I'm sorry.
And that's supposed to make you feel better.
Yeah. I told her, I have to kick you out of my practice, but I mean, I just, you can't do that. That's just not right. The other interesting situation, as I was a physician advisor at this community hospital, and one of the nurses in the ED said, Doc, can you look something up? This patient checked in with back pain, and I moonlighted another hospital, doing nursing, and I remember him from that other hospital, and he had a different name.
Oh, wow.
So I looked him up on the Illinois Prescription Drug Database, and taking his first name and his last name and his address, I pieced together that he had 31 different aliases that he was using in the Chicagoland area. He went in a 40-mile radius going to EDs, primary care physicians, urgent cares, 3 or 4 visits a month to different places with these 31 different names, getting prescriptions for opioids.
Unbelievable.
Now, maybe he does have chronic pain, but he's also selling those drugs.
Right.
And my argument to people who say, well, maybe you can't just deprive people of pain medicines. If they're selling their drugs, they're selling them to our children. right? Who don't understand what can happen with these drugs.
I think
Just crazy.
I think that's a brilliant point, and that leads me into another question that I want to ask you, and it's a clinical question, if that's all right. There's another what I consider disaster that has spawned from the crisis, and it's tied to the rise in the incidence of neonatal abstinence syndrome due to opioid use and misuse during pregnancy. So you started talking about the impact on our children, and this is something very near and dear to me, right? Because I raised 3 kids and now I have 5 grandchildren. So I obviously worry, and I found out from my wife yesterday. The school where where one of my granddaughters is going, a second grader last year brought marijuana to school and was smoking it in the bathroom. A second grader.
Wow.
Okay. Now, this stuff doesn't discriminate. They don't care where you live. It doesn't matter whether you live in New York City or you live in Podunk, USA, where I live. This stuff is out there. But can you talk a little bit about the dramatic increase in maternal opioid use and neonatal abstinence syndrome?
So honestly, I don't know the statistics well, but the basic concept if a woman has opioid use disorder, they're a chronic user, and they continue during pregnancy, when the baby is born, obviously the baby is going to not have a continued source of opioid. And the natural physiologic response is to create withdrawal. You often hear, and I hate the terminology, you hear that babies are born addicted, right? They're not born addicted. They're born with opioid dependence. And when obviously they don't have the maternal source, they develop withdrawal syndrome. And it's a very serious illness. The babies have to be treated very carefully, usually in the ICE intensive care unit, and have to be withdrawn from the drugs, monitored very closely for that. Fortunately, if they get through it all, they do very well. Then we, again, have to face the mother who still has an opioid dependent problem and now has to raise a child.
And this is scary. And, I know you said you didn't have the facts, but I'll throw a couple of these out here. The fact is, every 15 minutes, a baby is born suffering from opioid withdrawal. Okay? We're not going to use dependence. We'll call it opioid withdrawal. And the other big thing that the statistics are pointing to is because the mothers are now melting down these opioids and putting them into liquid form to inject them. There's now a significant spike in the number of Hep C cases and in HIV positive cases. So, I mean, we're seeing how the opioid crisis is tying multiple health issues into one crisis.
And maybe Matt has some perspective. I'll tell you, if you're a patient who has been on pills, let's say for legitimate pain, you develop a dependence, and then you start having to get it from illicit sources, right? So suddenly you're doctor shopping, you're kicked out of all the practices. Where do you turn? You turn to the street, where you're going to get illicit drugs. You're going to, heroin is cheaper than buying OxyContin, right? Yeah. And when you need that fix, you're going to end up, doing harmful behaviors that lead to a whole cascade of other illnesses.
Do you think? Go ahead, Dr. Hirsch. I'm sorry.
There's a big debate about needle exchange programs, but those that oppose them on the ethical ground that how can you give a drug abuser a needle? But until we can provide comprehensive drug treatment, accessible to everybody, affordable to everybody, why would we let them use a dirty needle that's going to just create that cascade of hepatitis C, HIV, a whole nother issue that's going to affect their health? It's going to affect everybody's health. It needs a comprehensive solution.
I'm with you. I agree. And until, this is going to be my one political dig, but it's across the spectrum. Until Congress takes big pharma out of their big pocket, we're not going to have a comprehensive solution. That's just my 2 cents about it. It bothers me tremendously to know that we have people suffering and struggling, and these are not junkies. These are good people. These are professionals who are struggling with this. I mean, you brought up Stephen King as an example. I mean, the guy is one of the most well-known, storytellers ever to walk the face of the earth. I mean, at least for the type of storytelling that he does. Um, but I got a question for you, Doc, and then Matt, I got some questions for you. Do you think that the CDC has done enough? Do you think, or I should say, has there been any new updates or any new guidance that you believe as a clinician address or help to combat some of what's going on with the crisis?
Well, actually, just recently, so let me back up. One of the best treatments available for opioid abuse disorder is Suboxone. So it's a medication that takes the place of the opioid. It doesn't create the euphoria, but it treats that dependence. In the past, physicians had to do 8 hours of training and get a special DEA license to prescribe those medications. And there was a limit on how many patients you could have. I believe it's still in place. They removed the waiver. It's called the X waiver, so that any physician can prescribe Suboxone. And what that allowed is that hospitals, ED doctors, when they get opioid abusers, overdoses, they can start treatment right away and get them in the program. So yeah, I mean, we need $1 billion. We need psychiatrists. We need drug addiction facilities. We need, but there are efforts being made to make things better.
Yeah, and the National Institutes of Health, you know, uh, again, I think it was a feeble response in just my humble opinion, but they indicated that they're focusing on 5 major priorities. And I'll ask you, Dr. Hirsch, if you think these are working as a clinician. And again, this is just your opinion on that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
They're improving access to treatment and recovery services, promoting use of overdose reversing drugs. To your point, Suboxone. So that's a good
Well,
one.
that's Narcan.
Or Narcan.
Narcan.
Yeah.
Okay.
We could talk about Narcan because the whole story with that cop that was exposed to fentanyl a couple days ago. I don't know if you heard about that.
No, what happened?
Yeah, that was scary.
San Diego, I think. A police officer they were searching a car because they pulled him over, I guess, and they found a bunch of fentanyl, powdered, fentanyl. And the picture shows the police officer reaching into the bag and then collapsing. And the story was that he touched fentanyl and he immediately overdosed. He didn't overdose on fentanyl, right? It's a fallacy. He had a vasovagal reaction. Something happened. Fentanyl does not cause overdoses by touching it. But they administered 4 doses of Narcan to him, thinking it was an overdose. He didn't supposedly reverse. He eventually woke up and is fine. And it's creating a whole big hullabaloo.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Read about it. It's kind of interesting. There's a big controversy about what's going on.
Yeah, I definitely will. That's a little freaky. Okay, so the other ones are strengthening our understanding of the epidemic through better public health surveillance, providing support for cutting-edge research on pain and addiction, and advancing better practices for pain management. I mean, again, are these things working?
Science is hard. If the more we can understand the origins of pain, perhaps there's going to be better treatments for it. Absolutely. And I think, there needs to be efforts on that. The problem is when they come out with a new drug, will it be unaffordable? And then we're stuck, what are we going to do? Prescribe them the $100 a day drug or give them the $3 a day or $3 a month opioid?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And Matt, to you, I'll ask you this question: as a former law enforcement officer and as a current defense attorney, what is it going to take for the right people to actually be held accountable?
Well, I actually think you're seeing that now, right? I think part of the reason why my case, as strong as I think as it wasn't didn't necessarily move through in the criminal direction was because at the time, 2010, 2011, these types of cases were more novel. And there wasn't quite a blueprint established on how to proceed with prosecuting these types of cases, as egregious as this one was, right? But if you just pay attention to OIG's criminal enforcement page, it's press release after press release of physicians, clinics, providers that are being held accountable for drug diversion, whether it's strictly a drug diversion under the Controlled Substance Act that DEA moves on, or if it's one that has a healthcare fraud component, and all of them can, that OIG, FBI, Mafuku, and others have developed. But I think, from the time that I investigated that case to where we are now, I think it moved forward leaps and bounds in the direction of holding these people accountable. Now, a couple of points about that, right? First is, I think the lack of early strong enforcement kind of helped the opioid epidemic somewhat grow because providers weren't being held accountable, right? That's just an opinion on my part, right? I think, I'm not unique in the fact that a case did not proceed criminally on these types of allegations. So I think that lack of enforcement kind of goes to what Dr. Hirsch was talking about in his article. And then, the other aspect is, we've got to come up with something that these physicians can do to demonstrate they're trying to do things correctly. Going towards the tox drug screening, right? What's the proper protocol? Is it do POC testing in the office in order to verify that the patient is taking the drugs that are being prescribed or not taking other drugs? Is it to, periodically take a sample and send it off to a lab for a qualitative or quantitative testing, right? So, I have clients that they have concerns, well, I have to do qualitative and quantitative testing or order that because if I don't, I'll get in trouble, right? Okay. But if you do, there's also potential to get in trouble. You could look at the United Health lawsuit against, I can't, Next Health, I think. But, and all these other payer actions against providers where they were billing for qualitative and quantitative testing, right? So it's trying to get a better grasp from the payers out there that are involved in this to say, hey, what's appropriate for this physician from a claim standpoint, to help address and ameliorate these kinds of issues.
And I think that goes to your point, Dr. Hirsch, what you were saying before. We need a comprehensive solution, and we need all players at the table, right?
Yeah. Can I ask Matt a question? I know it's your show, Sean.
No, please.
We had been discussing this earlier with, those that haven't seen the TV show on Peacock, Dr. Death. It's about a surgeon in Texas, neurosurgeon. And you watch this show and you say, how could this guy possibly have been able to continue doing what he was doing? And part of it was watching the DA talking to the investigators about whether they should prosecute her and what law they can use to prosecute this guy. And as someone watching this, I'm saying, it's so obvious he's killing people, harming people. How could there be any debate about it? So are there discussions, about what's prosecutable and what's winnable, and we don't want to take this case and then lose it and then look bad? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely conversations, and I think when we were dealing with this issue, I thought the healthcare fraud component was pretty straightforward, right? He was not using the fluoroscope and the manner with which it's required for that service. He didn't have enough of the steroid purchased in order to satisfy all those claims, right? It was, but even with that particular component of it, there's still questions. Well, okay, is it going to be viewed more as a medical necessity issue? Now, when it came to the death part, it's did we have the requisite information to demonstrate that his conduct directly led to the patient's death, right? And there's legitimacy to the conversation. This person might have had some illicit substances in their tox report, or there might have been a synergistic effect to the drugs that were involved in drug intoxication. So yeah, there were definitely conversations as to whether we could move forward on that and tie his conduct directly to that, so that and on a case like this, right? It's not necessarily we're going to hold him accountable or charge him with a murder, right? But under the healthcare fraud statute, there's an enhancement in the amount of years that you get, right? Healthcare fraud is a 10-year criminal statute. If you've caused bodily harm, it bumps up to 20. And if you cause death, it's a potential life sentence. So you're having those types of conversations. Now, I think when we were developing the case, and I worked really closely with the FBI, my FBI partner on this, we were having those conversations with the pathologist and saying, okay, of these drugs, you're saying mixed drug intoxication, are there ones that definitely killed him? And, in most cases with these 7 that we had kind of presented that the medical board latched onto, they were very comfortable saying, well, it's the drugs that he prescribed. They were on their own at lethal doses in the system. These other drugs, didn't have that impact on it. So yeah, you're having those kind of discussions with the prosecutor, depending on what you're trying to move forward on, right? We were going to move forward on a healthcare fraud case, and the deaths were simply going to be presented as an enhancement for the penalty phase. It's not like with Dr. Death that do we charge him with manslaughter? Do we charge him with murder? What do we charge him with? Do we charge him with aggravated assault? Right. And those were all interesting conversations. I'm actually, you mentioned that I'm actually friends with one of the prosecutors on that case, and was lucky enough when he was at Collin County before moving to Dallas County, there was some Collin County components to it because some of the patients were in Collin County. So I interned in law school with him at the DA's office and got to look over some of that stuff. So I've been fascinated with that case from the beginning. So that was
pretty. Yeah, that's pretty neat. Okay, so in the closing time that we have together, Doc, let me go to you first. I always, in closing for our podcast, I like to give our viewers, our listeners, a takeaway message. So as a physician, speaking to other physicians, to non-physician practitioners that are prescribing opioids and other pain relievers for their patients, to the administrators that are responsible for the operations of the organization, what would be your takeaway message?
The vast majority of people in healthcare are doing it for the right reasons. There's a very small number that are doing it for the wrong reasons. And their activities make all of us have to jump through a lot more hoops than we normally would have to. Right? The whole issue with documentation, again, is proving that we actually did what we did. The spinal injections wouldn't have NCDs and LCDs if doctors used them properly, and not as a money-making method. That small number who are doing it for those reasons. So I think we all get mad at regulations and all the hoops, but we have to realize that it's that small number. And a lot of it is, if I think we went to that doctor's community and asked how many of the other doctors in town knew this guy was pushing pills and doing bad stuff, I bet a lot of them would have said, oh yeah, we knew about him. And then you ask them, what did you ever do about it? Oh, we didn't do anything because we didn't want to get involved. So The small number affect all of us, but it's all our obligation to not stand back when we know bad things are happening.
Very well said. Very well said. Matt, I'll throw the same question to you. As a defense attorney, what advice could you give to our listeners out there who are in a high risk situation of prescribing opioids and other pain narcotics, that they could be proactive with to help mitigate some of the potential risks and dangers that they face?
Right. So, I mean, I think Dr. Hirsch hits it on the head that this case that I was involved with was a total aberrancy, an outlier. The vast majority of the physicians that are out there are trying to do it correctly. And even though that this case didn't go the criminal route that I would have liked it to go, the medical board got involved. They took action. They took action to limit the number of patients that he could do. They've monitored him to make sure that he's doing it correctly. And so I think at the end of the day, the medical board's intervention, although it didn't involve revocation of his license, maybe had a positive impact on the community, and maybe we saved some lives by making him change his conduct to reflect more of what is expected in the medical community for the services that he's providing. Now, to your question about what can we do, or what can those in the provider community do? Well, they can work with people like you, Sean, like me, like Eric Rubenstein, to sit down and go, hey, these are the services that we provide. These are the kinds of medications we prescribe. What are the pitfalls? What are the traps that we need to be aware of? And the big one being, you need to understand what red flags are and what kind of conduct is suspect with regards to patients. And when those red flags present, you need to be swift and decisive with what you do with those patients, right? It could be, how far is the patient coming to your clinic in order to see you, right? Are they 2 counties away and passing a bunch of other clinics? That's a little questionable. Have you gotten calls from family members concerned about the medications that are being prescribed? Are you hearing through the healthcare grapevine, because the healthcare community is very small, when you think about it and tighten it, that a patient of yours was treated for an overdose or is being treated for addiction, right? These are the things that the provider community needs to be aware of and take steps in order to address those, so that if somebody ever does come in and do a prepayment or post-payment audit or some sort of review, that you can say, hey, yes, we had this patient. We were proactive in our approach and looking at what they were doing and discovered problems, and we addressed the problems, right? It's all about being proactive, in my mind, in the compliance community.
Great points. Yep. And from my perspective, again, I think having solid policies and procedures in place, having your documentation reviewed by professionals, have a peer-to-peer review by somebody not in your organization who's not afraid to say to one of your doctors, I'm concerned. Folks, we work in an industry where investigations are prevalent, where audits are ongoing, where you have to dot the I's and cross the T's to ensure that you are covering your assets and mitigating your risks. So I'll stop us right there, because I know we could keep going and going. But I want to again say thank you to each and every single one of you, our listeners, our viewers, for tuning in each and every single week to hear what I and my special guests this week, attorney Matt Lawhon and Dr. Ronald Hirsch, we're talking about. I can't tell you again how appreciative I am for our time. I feel like we just started the conversation 5 minutes ago, and here we are, an hour and 10 minutes into it, and I think we're just scratching the surface. I will make available the link to kevinmd.com for Doc's article that he wrote. I will also provide some statistics and some other information that we discussed during the podcast today. And I'll also provide you a link to both Dr. Hirsch and to Matt Lawhon's bios, so that if you have questions, comments, or concerns, you have a way to get in touch with them. As always, LinkedIn, the three of us are always on there. We're always active. We're always happy to engage with any of you that have questions, comments, or concerns. So again, thank you for tuning in. This has been another episode of The Compliance Guy. My name is Sean Weiss. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, and we'll see you soon.